Good afternoon, everyone. Is everyone joining? Yes, okay, cool. I'll give it maybe like one more minute in case we are still missing anyone. But welcome, everybody. Before we launch fully in, just a couple of notes at the top. This meeting is being recorded, so if you want to come back and refer to it later, you will have a link available to you. And if you have questions as we go forward, feel free to put those in the Q&A box. We'll be monitoring both the Q&A box and the chat. But if you have a question, we just ask that you keep those in the Q&A box. And I guess we are probably ready to get started. So hello and welcome to the Office of Monitoring webinar, which will provide an overview of the monitoring process. This session is designed for representatives from organizations who have been selected for monitoring this spring. So if that is you, then welcome. If that is not you, feel free to catch us next time. So first, we're going to do a couple of introductions. My name is Jackie. I have been with the Office of Monitoring since 2020, and prior to that, I worked in the field with an ASN grantee for about 7 years, which followed my service as an AmeriCorps member. So I have been with the agency in a couple different capacities for most of my adult life, and I will pass it off to Selima to introduce herself.
Thank you, Jackie. Hello, everyone. Welcome. My name is Selima Shabazz, and I am a monitoring officer assigned to the West region. So if you are based out of the West region, then more than likely I will be working with you, and I look forward to that. And I joined AmeriCorps back in 2020, so I've been with the office since its early days, and I'm excited to be still here and working with the team here. So I will pass it over to Alex.
Hey, good afternoon, everyone. My name is Alex Delaney. I am the Acting Deputy Director of the Office of Monitoring. Similar to Selima and Jackie, I have been here with this office for a few years now since its stand-up. Been with the agency for about 5 years now. Looking forward to having the chance to meet with you all this afternoon and give a little bit of an overview of the monitoring process.
And I'll just jump in and introduce myself very quickly. Hello, everyone. Good afternoon. I'm Caroline Fernandez. I'm now the Acting Director in the Office of Monitoring. And like Alex, have been here since the inception and stand-up of the office in 2019. Prior to that, my federal experience included working at SAMHSA, a part of HHS, and at HUD. And we're really looking forward to this cycle of monitoring. Welcome, everyone.
Thanks, everyone. And I failed to mention, I'm assigned to the Northeast region. So if you are in the Northeast, there's a high probability that we'll be working together over the next couple of months. So Selima and I are going to run through the slides here and just give a quick overview of the process, and then Caroline and Alex will be here to support with some Q&A as we move forward. So our agenda today, we'll run through the objectives of monitoring. We'll then discuss the life cycle of the process and how we will communicate through that whole process. We'll discuss next steps and what you can expect from us over the next couple of weeks and the timing of our monitoring kickoff. We'll talk a little bit about Hive, which is our secure platform for document submission and review. And then we'll run through some resources that are available to you now and will remain available to you throughout the process should you have questions. And finally, we'll leave some space at the end for some Q&A. So first, our objectives. So first we'll talk a bit about the objective. So this is sort of like the why of monitoring, like why is this happening, why we go about things the way that we do. A quick reminder before we move forward, though, the Office of Monitoring, for those of you who are a little bit newer to the agency, the Office of Monitoring is only a couple of years old. It was born out of the Transformation and Sustainability Plan, which had been moving forward for the past couple of years prior to the agency switch or the administration switch. But that plan separated out monitoring activities from the rest of our grants management activities. So previously, our grants management and portfolio management were sort of, or our compliance management and portfolio management were combined. TSP sort of separated those things out. So we are still very much building out some of these processes, which has really kind of been built out over the past couple of years. We always are looking to hear your feedback on that. So just to say that up at the jump. Agency, so part of our objectives is to meet agency wide monitoring regulatory requirements. So monitoring is part of what we as an agency have to do as per the regulations. So every grantee really should be expected to be monitored at some point. So this is not something that you are being subject to because you are in quote unquote trouble or something along those lines. This is something that everyone should expect to see during the course of their grants management. So the first objective is to assess compliance with all of the requirements. Those are statutory, regulatory, and agency policy requirements. Second, we are aiming to collect data from across the agency on both our strengths and our areas for growth, so that we are able to inform the agency internally on where we can enhance our training and technical assistance. Third, we are looking to continuously improve the agency's monitoring procedures based on monitoring activities and results. And fourth, we are, of course, trying to make sure that we are meeting all compliance with federal regulations. So just continuing here along with the objectives, a little bit about what monitoring is and what it is not. First, what monitoring is very routine. It is targeted. We make every effort to ensure that we are monitoring in such a way that we are focusing on one or two specific areas. For the most part, we are required by the regulations, so that's part of what the monitoring is just something that we are upholding our end of the CFR. It is used to inform training and technical assistance offered by the agency, and it is applied to the prime grantee, which is something that we'll come back to a couple of times. What monitoring is not, it is not a direct result of wrongdoing. You're not selected because you are quote unquote in trouble in any way. Everyone should expect this at some point. It is not an audit, and it is not related to OIG activities or improper payment activities. I just wanted to draw that distinction up front. Sometimes what different bodies are asking for can be a little bit confusing, but I just want to make sure that we're drawing the distinction that monitoring is not the same as an audit and is not the same as what the OIG or PIIA offices are doing. And it is not applied directly to subrecipients. So that will make a little bit more sense why we're emphasizing that later. But just to say from the top that we are working directly with the prime grantee, and anything that we do with the subrecipients will always be, we will always start with the prime grantee before moving forward there. Okay, so here is an overview of our monitoring life cycle. So you can see you are here up in pre-monitoring. So this is where we are looking at monitoring activity assignments for the fiscal year, and assigning those to monitoring officers who then will notify the grantee of their assignment. It is very likely that you will receive an initial notification in the next couple of weeks, but I'll go through that timeline in greater detail in the next slide. But all of you should have received some kind of notification last week, just kind of giving you a heads up saying, you will be monitored at some point this year. Also in the pre-monitoring phase is when we will ask you to submit your documents that we will review. And that's when we will ask for any supplemental documentation or ask any questions if we've got them. So monitoring, this yellow arrow section includes us doing an assessment, a compliance assessment of the documents that you've submitted, and sending you that monitoring report, which will show any findings if applicable and let you know what steps we'll have to take moving forward. And then post-monitoring and closeout, if there were any findings, that's where we will discuss the corrective action plan and have that submitted. That sometimes takes some time to go back and forth with your monitoring officer, but ultimately that will result in a CAP review and approval and then a notification of closeout. Okay, next I'll talk about a very, very general timeline. I do want to highlight that we are still bringing on a few folks in our office. So some of you may be assigned to monitoring officers who are either just getting started or haven't quite gotten started yet. So your timeline might be a little further back than your peers, but generally speaking, in many cases, your monitoring officer will be sending out notifications in the next week or so. Again, many of you might be a little bit later than that, but I will kind of talk from that frame. So in the first month, so around March or April or later, depending, is when you will receive your notifications, get your access to Hive, and submit your initial documentation. So that is initial documentation is like the first round of things that we'll request. And from there, sometimes we will ask for supplemental documentation, which includes samples or additional documents that kind of back up the initial request. In the second month, that is mostly spent on us reviewing that documentation, sending out the supplemental requests, and you all uploading those supplemental requests. Around the third month is where the majority of OM's time is spent on document review. If you are assigned a National Service Criminal History Check monitoring activity, that's when you'll be able to provide additional documents if there were findings in the initial scope. The fourth month, again, very generally, is when you are likely to receive your monitoring report, which will show results and indicate any findings and whether or not a CAP or corrective action plan is required. If one is required, months 5 and 6 and potentially beyond that is when the CAP is submitted, reviewed, approved, and implemented. And then once everything there is wrapped up is when you will close out. I do want to highlight that this timeline can be either much shorter or much longer, depending on how quickly you are able to respond and you know, how much documentation we might be missing after your initial document upload. So I would just say, generally speaking, you can help move this process a little bit faster with quick responses and with complete responses. Sometimes it will take a little bit longer depending on what activity you were assigned and how many records are required. So again, this is very much a general overview. Okay, next, a quick notification of the monitoring assignment. So this is what you should be expecting to see from your monitoring officer in the next few weeks. This is like sort of more specific follow-up to the notification that you would have received last week, or I guess maybe the week before. So it will come to the authorized representative that is identified in eGrants. So if you feel like that contact might be out of date or require some sort of update, please reach out to the monitoring inbox. We'll have that contact up on the last slide. But that's who will receive the notification. We will be CCing the project director and your portfolio manager, who the portfolio manager will sort of be in and out of this communication throughout the full process. But anytime that there's an action taken, they will be CC'd on it. If you are an ASN grantee, we are making sure that the ASN folks are looped in on it as well. So you'll see that ASN info is CC'd on the notification. You'll see that it in the email, you'll see an attachment that includes the formal notification letter. So we just recommend that you keep that with your grant records. It'll summarize what monitoring activity or activities were assigned, as well as the period of assessment, which is the date range that we're really looking at. That's something I just want to take a minute to define. Our assessment period is very targeted. So that's, for the most part, what we are looking at is any grant activities that took place in that identified assessment period. So that's important to take note of when you see your monitoring notification. This notification will also show you the deadlines for responding to the initial document request. So just please do take note of those. And it will show you who your monitoring officer is and their contact information. So if you have any follow-up questions, they're the first stop for you. It will also include an attachment which will show you how to use Hive. It's the external user guide, which will show you how to get into the account and sort of how to navigate all of that, as well as a recording. It's a web link that you can click on to see a recording of how to navigate the Hive system, which is very helpful. I definitely recommend taking a look at that. And I believe we will also be including the link from the recording today. I think with that, I will pass this on to Selima.
Thank you, Jackie. Oh, just a quick mic check. Can you hear me?
You are a little bit quiet, but I can hear you.
Okay. How about now?
That's a little bit better.
Okay, great. All right, so I'm going to start us off by talking about using Hive Zengen, which is a secure online platform that the Office of Monitoring uses to facilitate our monitoring activities. And essentially what that means is we use Hive to communicate with your organization the documentations that need to be submitted, as well as to share with you the results of your monitoring assignment. So once your monitoring officer completes their compliance assessment, they will have the results in Hive for you to be able to review and then download a copy for your records. So on this screen here, it is a copy or an image of the sign-in screen, just so that you can become familiar with what that platform looks like. Next slide, please. So I talked about using Hive, and now I want to talk about accessing Hive. So the authorized representative for your organization will receive an email from the noreply@email.zengenhq.com with a link to your assigned monitoring activity. And this email will come after you receive your kickoff email from your monitoring officer. I saw in the chat there were some questions about that. So the emails from your monitoring officer have not yet been sent out. So don't be alarmed if you have not received one. They will be coming out as soon as tomorrow, but as Jackie mentioned, you may not receive that kickoff email for the next couple of weeks or even for the next couple of months. But for accessing Hive, again, an email will be sent to the authorized representative with a link to your assigned monitoring activity. If you do not receive this email within 24 hours after receiving your kickoff email from your monitoring officer, please do check your spam inbox to see if it was sent there. Sometimes that does happen. If it's not in your spam box, then by all means, please do reach out to your monitoring officer, and she will work with you to troubleshoot getting you access to Wise Hive. Also, as Jackie mentioned, when you receive your kickoff email from your monitoring officer, attached to that email will be a copy of the Wise Hive external user guide. So we do encourage you to read through the user guide to help you create a new user account, your password, and to sign in. If you have any difficulties, please do contact monitoring@cns.gov for assistance, and also you can reach out to your authorized representative. Next slide, please. All right, so I do want to just talk a little bit more about using Wise Hive, and I'm going to start with how monitoring officers use Wise Hive. So again, monitoring officers use Wise Hive to communicate to your organization the initial documentation, as well as any supplemental documentation that needs to be submitted. And I do want to just highlight here, in Wise Hive, there is a description for all of the documents that need to be submitted. So we do encourage you to take the time to read through those descriptions in order to ensure that you are providing correct and complete information to us. So we do use Wise Hive to communicate to you the documents that need to be submitted. And then in addition, we use Wise Hive to identify individuals selected for interviews. So if you are assigned a financial and operational fitness assessment, or FOFA, a monitoring activity for short, or a program specific monitoring activity, or a prohibited activities, then your monitoring officer will need to conduct interviews with staff, volunteers, and/or members. So your monitoring officer will let you know the specific individuals who've been selected for monitoring, and/or they may let you know that they would like to speak with someone who holds a specific position or title. So for example, if you were assigned a FOFA monitoring activity, your monitoring officer may say, I would like to speak with someone who's responsible for payroll. So up next, your monitoring officer will provide the monitoring results in Wise Hive. If the compliance assessment results in any findings or non-compliance, your monitoring officer will include notes that describe that describes the non-compliance. And then lastly, if your monitoring report does show non-compliance, then you will need to develop a corrective action plan, and your monitoring officer does use Wise Hive to complete that process, including sending you feedback on your corrective action plan, as well as status updates, letting you know whether your CAP has been approved. Next slide, please. All right, so continuing on with using Wise Hive, your organization will use Wise Hive in a number of different ways. So after you created a user account, set up your password, and are able to sign into Wise Hive, the very first thing that you will need to do is to acknowledge your monitoring activity. So you will be prompted to acknowledge that you've been assigned a monitoring activity and that you are aware of the monitoring responsibilities, such as uploading documents. So that will be the very first thing that you will do. After you acknowledge your monitoring activity, you will be able to review your assigned monitoring activity, which essentially means you'll be able to review the initial documentation request. And as I mentioned earlier, there will be a description for all of the initial documents that are being requested, just to guide you on what type of information we are looking for. Depending on whether or not your monitoring officer needs some additional information, you may be asked to submit supplemental documentation and/or clarifying information. So your monitoring officer will be taking an initial review of what you submit, and may have questions for you about the documents. So you may receive some questions in Hive asking you for clarifying information. And as I mentioned before, once your monitoring officer completes their compliance assessment, you will have access to the monitoring results. And we encourage you to review and download a copy of your monitoring results and to keep a copy for record keeping. And if your monitoring report shows that you have any findings or non-compliance is identified, then you will need to submit your corrective action plan in Hive along with any supporting documentation. And then lastly, the final, as well as any iterations of your CAP report, will be accessible to you in Hive for you to review and to download. And just once more, I do want to plug to use the Hive external user guide for step-by-step instructions on navigating through the system. Next slide, please. All right, so now I do want to talk with you about some resources to help you prepare for your monitoring assignment. And I do want to plug AmeriCorps' website. On this slide here, we do have a direct link to our website, and you will have access to a copy of this presentation that will be included in the kickoff email that will be sent to you from your monitoring officer. But again, I do want to share with you some resources that are really helpful to help you prepare for monitoring. So the first resource is a remote monitoring at a glance document. So if you would like to have a comprehensive overview of the monitoring process from beginning to end, we do want to direct you to our website to download the remote monitoring at a glance document. It does provide estimated timelines for each stage in the monitoring process. And again, it does provide information on the comprehensive process from beginning to end. Up next, and this one is a really important resource, which is the overview of Uniform Monitoring Package, or UMP. I can't stress this one enough. This is a really incredibly useful tool for everyone here on the call who's preparing for your monitoring. I will go into a little bit more detail on the next slide, but what I'll say here is that it provides an overview of the 5 monitoring activities that we conduct here in the Office of Monitoring, as well as provide exact language or the exact questions that your monitoring officers are using to conduct their monitoring. So we're being fully upfront, and we want to share with you what exactly what types of questions we're asking to help ensure your success. The next resource is a guide to developing corrective action plans. Again, this is only applicable if your organization monitoring results show a finding or show that there is a non-compliance. And so if that is the case, then you will need to develop a corrective action plan. So we put together this resource here to help you navigate through that process. We will have a follow-up conversation a few months down the road once monitoring is, once a lot of the monitoring is finished, to help guide organizations through corrective action plans where needed. The next resource is a segregation of duties worksheet. So if your organization was assigned a financial and operational fitness assessment, again, that's FOFA for short, then you will need to complete a segregation of duties worksheet. So if you do want to get an advanced glance at what that worksheet looks like, you can download a copy of that worksheet from our website and begin to prepare the information that will be needed to complete this worksheet. I do want to mention that a copy of or a link to the segregation of duties worksheet will be linked in Hive for easy access. But again, if you would like to get an advanced look at this, or if you're curious about what that looks like, even if you're not assigned a FOFA monitoring activity, you can access it here. Then next is a list of subaward worksheets. So this is if you've been assigned a subrecipient oversight monitoring activity, as well as a program-specific monitoring activity, then you may need to complete the subawards worksheet. And so again, if you want to get an advanced look at what that looks like, you can access it on our website. And then lastly, we do have an FAQ section. So we do encourage you to take a look at our FAQs in case that your question is already answered there. But of course, if your question is not on the FAQ section, please do feel free to reach out to the monitoring inbox, that's monitoring@cns.gov, and the management team will certainly get back to you with an answer. Next slide, please. All right, so I do want to just spend a little bit more time going over the overview of Uniform Monitoring Package. Again, that's the UMP for short. On the left side of the screen, it does show a diagram of the 5 different monitoring activities that are conducted here in the Office of Monitoring. The green boxes are for the Financial and Operational Fitness Assessment. Again, that's FOFA for short. The golden box is for the subrecipient oversight monitoring. That's our second type of monitoring activity that we conduct. The blue boxes are for the program-specific monitoring that we conduct. So there's monitoring specific for ASN, VISTA, AmeriCorps seniors, and days of service. So we're looking to make sure that your organization is following the program requirements for each grant type. And then in the magenta box, we have the National Service Criminal History Check. And then last but not least, in the orange box is the prohibited activities. So again, the diagram on the left is an overview of the 5 different types of monitoring activities that are conducted in the Office of Monitoring. And then on the right side of the screen, we have a table here. I know the text is quite small, so don't worry. We just put this here for illustration to highlight the fact that you do have access to the questions that we are asking as monitoring officers or answering as monitoring officers to determine whether you are compliant with the requirements, CFRs, or policy requirements. So for example, the prohibited activities has 10 different questions that a monitoring officer is answering. So the first question here is, do members or volunteers service activities aligned with their position description / assignment plans? So you can see the exact question that the monitoring officer is answering and will be using the information that you provide to us or will be using information from interviews to answer these questions. So again, the exact questions, not only for prohibited activities, but for all of the monitoring activities are available on our website. And we strongly encourage you to review this information in preparation for your monitoring assignment. Next slide, please. All right, so also on our website, you're able to sign up with Litmos to have a Wise Hive demonstration. If you would like to become a little bit more familiar with the system and get a demonstration of the system, then you can just follow the steps on our website to create a Litmos account if you don't already have one, and then you'll be able to have a demonstration of the system. And then on the right side of this screen here is just a flow chart for the monitoring process using Wise Hive. So beginning with the first line with the blue, oval there, monitoring activity is assigned, and then the next step is documentation intake. And I'm going from left to right here. Once the documentation is submitted by your organization, it will go under review. Your monitoring officer will do an initial review of that information. if it's insufficient, or if your monitoring officer has questions or needs supplemental documentation, which is very common, then you will be requested to submit additional information. And then it will, as you can see with the arrow, loop back to documentation intake. If your monitoring officer does not need any additional information, or if the documentation that you provided, they don't have any questions about it, they will then begin the monitoring progress. They will then begin the compliance assessment. So I'm now in the middle row in that blue rectangle where it says monitoring in progress. If there are no findings, then hooray, your monitoring is complete, and that would conclude the monitoring assignment. But if findings are identified, then you will need to move into the corrective action plan process. So I'm not going to go into great detail about the CAP process, as we will cover that information further down the road once we get further into the monitoring process. Next slide, please. So just a quick recap, monitoring kickoff emails and documentation request notifications will go out as soon as tomorrow, but may be sent out over the next few months. So please don't be alarmed if you don't receive a notification immediately. As Jackie mentioned, we're still onboarding some monitoring officers and are actually still filling some positions. So the start date for monitoring will vary. Please feel free to reach out to the monitoring inbox if you would like to have, if you would like to get a little bit more information on when you can expect to receive that notification. We'll be able to communicate with you a general timeline for that. But once you receive the monitoring kickoff email, then your monitoring officer will become your primary point of contact, and you can email and get in contact with them with any questions that you may have, and they will be working with you directly throughout the monitoring process. But in the meantime, please do direct your questions to monitoring@cns.gov, and we'll be sure to get a response back to you. And so I think that is it, and we'll open it up for questions and answers.
All right, thank you, Jackie and Selima. We do have a number of questions in the Q&A panel. Before I start passing them off to the two of you, I do want to address a grouping of them. That there were a few questions around IPERA or PIIA OIG audits and monitoring, the difference around them and how we take them into account in creating the monitoring plan. So I want to give a little bit of an overview on that process before moving on to the remaining questions. So I think they differ in two main ways, one being the originating source of the activity and the other being the scope of the activity. So the Office of Inspector General audits are originated through the Office of Inspector General, which is an independent entity from our agency that's responsible for oversight of our agency's activities. And those audits and investigations are typically more broad and go more in depth and are a longer and more involved process than what you'll see through our monitoring activities. And we do, when creating the monitoring plan, we do provide the plan to the Office of Inspector General for their review and feedback, so that in the majority of cases, if there is an ongoing OIG audit, we will not be pursuing a monitoring activity at that time. So there should not be much overlap in those two activities. The monitoring assessments that we've been talking about today are a little bit narrower in scope. As Jackie mentioned, they are targeted in most cases to a specific activity or two, as opposed to a more organization-wide approach. And the IPERA or PIIA assessment reviews are the most targeted, really looking at strictly financial transactions and making sure that those transactions are within regulations. And there are a couple other questions related to, if we're moving forward with a monitoring activity, can we expect less IPERA reviews or less assessments in that way? Our two offices do act independently in that regard. The Office of the Chief Risk Officer is responsible for creating the IPERA assessment process. They use some statistically random sampling methods. So there is not necessarily a direct line connection between the two. With that said, if there are specific times where we are asking for documentation and you are up against a deadline with IPERA or with an assessment there we do have some flexibility in providing extensions that you can work with your monitoring officer directly to discuss, and that's always something that we are willing to take into consideration. But overall, it is a separate process. All right. So Jackie, I'll pass this first question off to you. Can you share which regions may be on a bit of delay so that we know what we can expect activities to kick off? I did actually respond to this in the chat, but if you wanted to re-emphasize that.
Sure. I missed your response in the chat. It's hard to see the chat when screen sharing, but I can say that generally speaking, we are, that is probably not a region specific, won't be a region specific delay. It is likely that there will be a couple of grantees in each region that are on a little bit of a later timeline than others. But generally speaking, most regions now have at least one monitoring officer who is working within them. Alex, did you want to add anything to that or correct that?
Yeah, no, that's correct. The only addition that I added in the chat was if you wanted to reach out to the monitoring@cns.gov inbox to ask that specific question for your grantee organization in particular, we may be able to give you an estimated timeline around that. However, I would suggest waiting for another week or so because the majority of the activities will be starting within the next 1 to 2 weeks. And if you have not received further notification at that point, you're welcome to reach out to the monitoring inbox and we can provide you with an estimated timeline that we have at that point.
Great, thank you.
And Jackie, keeping it with you, a question around notifications and communication. Can we request individuals get added to the monitoring communication in addition to the program director and authorized rep? Or if once we receive notification, we respond with additional folks, will that get them added to the ongoing communication?
Yes, this is a great question, and I will say a few things about this. If you would like someone in addition to the program director and authorized rep on your just on the email communication, that is not a problem. Just make sure that you let your monitoring officer know that in writing, and they will continue to loop in whoever it is that you need looped in. In terms of people's access to Hive or like the actual notifications that are getting sent out, the notifications are going to continue to be sent out addressed to the authorized rep, but feel free to have us include someone on the email that receives that notification. Access to Hive is limited to one person, but we have found a few pretty good workarounds the last round to kind of facilitate shared, I know that in many cases you're going to be sharing responsibility with a few folks in your office on answering some of those questions. So there are some workarounds there as well. I would just say communicate with your monitoring officer up front who you want to be involved in which steps, and they will work with you on that. And then I see there's a second question right after that. Can the authorized representative set up additional user accounts for our organization on Hive? And just to reiterate, unfortunately, Hive only has the ability to bring one authorized person from the organization into your account. There have been some ways that folks have worked through that as well. There are a few steps in the process that your monitoring officer will be able to provide you with sort of like lists of everything that needs to be accomplished so that you guys can work together on your end and then one person can submit it. So there are a few ways that folks have figured out how to work around that, and it's not too bad. But yeah, only one person can be assigned to each account, unfortunately. And that's a Hive thing.
And Jackie, I do just want to add to that, that the initial WISE Hive access is granted to the authorized representative. And while it's true that only one member of the staff can have access to WISE Hive, we do have the ability to change who that person is. So if after you get your initial access, you determine that there's somebody better suited than the authorized representative of the grant who will be working more closely with the monitoring officer on this process, we do have the ability to change that access to whoever you deem most fit.
Thanks, Alex.
And we'll keep it going. One more question on communication, Jackie. I'm still new to this, and this is my first monitoring. If I, as director, was copied on the original notification, is it safe to say that I will also be copied on the monitoring assignment?
Yes, it is pretty safe to say that, unless you or someone else in your office has asked us to change the contact for your organization, likely whoever received the initial notification will continue receiving notifications. But whoever else from your office was CC'd on that, I would, it never hurts to be safe. So just check with them and make sure that they haven't received anything that you haven't. But yeah, generally speaking, if you receive the first one, you'll continue being on those emails.
Great. And I will take this next one, a question from the chat. All of our documents are written in Spanish. Do we need to translate them? We do have Spanish language capabilities on our team. I would suggest that once you get the monitoring notification, to bring this point up with your monitoring officer and discuss what may or may not need to be done. But for the most part, we do have ability to review Spanish documentation as needed. And Selima, I will ask you to jump in on this one around some of the specific monitoring activities. So if we got a program-specific monitoring in our notification, we are only doing the questions in the Vista section, correct? Or do we also do reporting on prohibited activities?
Sure, I'll take this one. So yes, you would only, if in your letter it identified that you were selected for program specific, you would only be answering the Vista questions. You are not assigned the prohibited activities. So we would not, your monitoring officer would not also be reviewing those questions. We would only be looking at the program specific questions related directly to the Vista program.
Great, thank you. And there, I do see another related question, so I'll go ahead and hop on that. Just if our notification letter states program specific, does that mean we do not complete FOFA and NSCHC sections? Yes, so as Selima just mentioned, you will only be completing the sections that are assigned to you for the programs or for the specific activity that you are assigned to. And actually, this will be even less of an issue as the process gets started, because as you get your WISE Hive access, you will only be receiving the WISE Hive login for the specific activity that's assigned to you. And only those questions and document requests will be relayed to you through the process. All right, and Selima, another monitoring activity question. For the cost testing portion of FOFA monitoring type, is the type of documentation reviewed the same as what is required for PIIA?
Well, for the cost testing documentation, we will be selecting, randomly selecting transactions from the payment management system. We will let you know which transaction we have selected, and then we'll be requesting that you provide supporting documentation for that PMS drawdown. So that's the type of documentation that we will be requesting for cost testing within the FOFA section.
Thank you. And I will add to that, in general, it will be the same types of supporting documentation that you probably would have been providing for PIIA, in that we want to see the underlying documentation of any expenses within that sample that Selima talked about. And we do provide specific instructions in terms of what type of supporting documentation we're looking for different expense types in WISE Hive when we put out that request. So there's a document request description that outlines, what we're looking for if the costs included are staff time, or if they're travel expenses or member expenses. We talk through kind of what specific documentation we're looking for those kind of costs there. All right. So just to be clear, the initial letter we received about this webinar is a pre-monitoring activity. We wait to receive another email to start the 15-day window. Jackie, do you want to answer that one?
Sure. Yes, that is correct. The notification that you have received before today, I would call more of like a sort of like a heads up notification, like this is coming. So just keep an eye out for it. But the actual clock begins when you receive your notification from your monitoring officer. So you'll receive that. Again, it might be tomorrow, it might be in a couple weeks from now, but that email from your monitoring officer is the one that kind of gets the ball rolling.
Awesome, thank you. All right, so if we have key staff out for several weeks at a time in the coming months, are we able to request extensions for deadlines if needed? So yeah, I mentioned this briefly, but that is something that you would bring up with your monitoring officer. We do have some flexibilities around extensions, and we would just want to talk through the underlying reasons and narrow down a time frame for that. But if there are significant staff absences that would be required for completion of the activity, it's definitely something that we can talk through, and we have some flexibility there. So for program review, are a percentage of volunteer files, documentation reviewed, or are all required? So I will answer this. Jackie or Selima, if you have anything to add, please feel free to jump in. So for the most part, these program activities, this is a great example of when Jackie was talking through the initial documentation and then supplemental documentation. So part of the initial documentation that we'll be requesting is an active roster of members for certain programs. And from that roster, we will make a sample selection of some individual members for volunteer files or interviews if required. So there will not be, we will not be requiring that information of all active members, assuming that you have more than 2 to 3 active members. But otherwise, it'll be more of a sample-based request. All right, and for ASN grants, are we monitoring fixed amount grants under a FOFA or just cost reimbursement? So for a FOFA activity, we would just be looking at cost reimbursement ASN grants at this time. So could you clarify if the monitoring activity will cover 1 year or 2 for NSCHC, for example? So great question. In the initial notification that we sent out and in this follow-up one, the kickoff notification, we've included the monitoring assessment period, which is a 9-month period that we are looking at. So we are reviewing activity that happened within that 9-month time period. That said, for NSCHC in particular, and we would be looking at members or staff who are in covered NSCHC positions during that time period. So if the initial check was completed, a year or 2 ago, or in the case of a staff member, even longer than that, we would still be looking at that initial check, even though it's outside of the assessment window, because they are active in the assessment period that we're looking at. All right, so that is it for the Q&A. I think we touched on the majority of the questions in the chat. I do have one note. There was a question in there, will we have our monitoring officer's email in case we have specific questions? And yes, so starting with this monitoring kickoff and document request notification, all future communication regarding your monitoring activity will come directly from your monitoring officer. So you will have their contact information and you will be working closely with them throughout the process. Oh, I see we did get one more pop up in the Q&A. Thank you for that. Will you have a general percentage of files selected for NSCHC? Jackie, can you answer that one?
Yes. So we will so there's a couple of things to say. One, we are focusing on one grant. So if you are an organization that might have a national grant and some state grants or some combination thereof, we are just focusing on the covered individuals in that one particular grant. So starting there, we will either begin our sample with 25 records or 10%, I believe, of the 10% of the covered individual number in that grant. So if you have 800 all members, like 800 members on one grant, we will start with 80 because we pick the greater of those two. So either 10% or 25, whichever is greater. And then depending on if there are any findings, we may have to move into scope expansion, but we will begin with either 25 or 10%.
Great, thank you.
And Alex, I just wanted to add one thing onto the last question you spoke about, where someone was asking, I think, about whether they will have access to their monitoring officer's contact information and what communication will come from them. Just wanted to kind of plug that, I don't want to speak on behalf of everyone, but I'm going to, that all of the monitoring officers are, generally speaking, we all prefer communication and making sure that everything is clear. So if you have any questions throughout the process, please do reach out. We're all pretty open to phone calls or video conference or screen sharing or things like that, just to make sure that everyone's on the same page, because everything is much more, I think, efficient for everyone once we all have a common understanding of what's needed and what might be needed further. So please don't hesitate to reach out to any of us. Everyone is very welcoming of questions and conversations.
Yes, thank you. Great point. And I will also actually add an additional plug onto that. In this notification that you will be receiving to kick off the monitoring process, there is a note both in the email and in the attached letter that monitoring officers are available to schedule a follow-up call after this notification. If you would think it would be helpful to set up a call with them just to kind of talk through the monitoring process, to answer any questions that have popped up in the meantime before you start putting documentation together, to clarify what the documentation requests are and make sure you're on the same page. It's a great opportunity just to be able to touch base with your monitoring officer before or right as the process is starting. So that is definitely an option for everyone as well. All right.
Looks like we had 2 more Q&As pop up. Well, Q's, not A's yet. I'll start with the second one, Alex, and then maybe pass it back to you or Selima for the first one. I see a question from Allison. If you have time for one more Q, will NSCHC include staff as well as members? It will include all covered individuals. I would say that the assessment period will almost certainly focus on covered individuals who began service after the regulations changed. So depending on if you have a fixed award or a cost reimbursement grant or whatever situation applies to you that may or may not require you to run staff checks. So I would just, to answer your question, go back and take a look at the new regulation. We will almost certainly be focusing in on folks whose check needed to be done after that reg went through.
Great. All right. So, and this other question, is there a general percentage of files for prohibited activities too? There is not a percentage as there is in NSCHC, but we do have a sample guidelines for who we interview in regard to prohibited activities. And Selima and Jackie, please correct me if I'm wrong, but I believe in most cases it will be up to 6 members, 3 site supervisors, and 1 prime staff member that we would want to touch base with around the prohibited activities monitoring activity.
Great.
And of course, this will all be included in communication from your monitoring officer in scheduling those interviews, and that information will be provided that way as well.
And just to clarify really quickly, we are focusing on the new reg. I just want to come back to that last question. If you started before May 1st, but needed to come into compliance with the November regulation because now all of the checks are applicable to everyone. That's more what we're looking at. You still, even if someone has started before May 1, it's still fair game. I hope that clarifies that. I know it's a little bit confusing. If you have more questions, please feel free to follow up after this is over.
All right, it looks like we are just a little bit over time. Thank you all for the great questions. As we mentioned, we will make a recording of this presentation available on our monitoring website, along with a copy of the slides. And the slides will also be provided to you in the monitoring kickoff notifications. If you have any questions in the meantime, before you hear from your monitoring officer directly, please don't hesitate to reach out to us at monitoring@cns.gov. Thank you all for your time this afternoon.
Bye, everybody.